I want to continue this story with some of the more exciting missions. While I was over there, one of the first things that happened, kind of scary, was we took off out of Tonsanute, and it was a night mission, and we're flying along in the dark, and of course when you're flying, we're not but 2,500 feet above the ground, so we were pretty low. You never flew with any lighting. Most of the time, when you're regular flying, you have lights on each wing, and you got lights on the tail, and you got lights underneath and on top. Well, when we were over there, you only flew with the top beacon lit, so the people on the ground couldn't see you. And we had our top beacon on, and it was pretty clear that night, and we were just driving along, headed out to Cambodia. And all of a sudden, I was kind of looking outside, and the co-pilot, a guy named Ralph Lafarth, he was my co-pilot and was for quite a while, but he and I were flying together that night. And he and I both at the same time, we saw a red light flicker, and I reached over and turned the landing lights on, and when I turned them on, I could see another aircraft coming exactly straight for us, and it was a C-47, another old prop-driven plane, and it was being flown by Vietnamese. Luckily, both me and the Vietnamese pilot broke hard left, and how we missed each other, how we missed clipping wings or running head on, it's a miracle. But we had a near miss, and of course everybody in the back of the plane started yelling, "Hey, what are you doing? You're trying to hurt us," and all this kind of stuff. And we explained to them that we just had a near head-on collision, and we actually just saved everybody's life. And but that really made you realize that you can't take a second off of full focus on what you're doing, otherwise you might end up dead. I mean, if we'd hadn't reacted the way we did, we'd have hit and would have taken all of us out without even knowing what happened. So that was pretty exciting. Another mission, which I'm kind of proud of, is we were named the Shadow Shooter of the Week. They had a white chalkboard posted in operations, and every week somebody that did something a little extra, would get his name up there and his crew names up there. Well, I was out flying. Actually, it was for my instructor rating, so I could teach other people to be the pilot in the 119. And a Colonel Strickland was our instructor. He was a mean old lieutenant colonel, but he was fair, but he was just really harsh and direct to the point. He didn't sugarcoat anything. So he was in the jump seat, and we were out talking to ground commanders in Cambodia, looking for some action. And one of the navigators was on the night observation device, and he had it focused out on the area, looking for campfires or engine heat or anything like that, which that device would pick up. And he says, "Pilot," he said, "I just have spotted multiple campfires located in that forest." And he said, "I can't tell how many, there's just so many." Well, Colonel Strickland says, "Break off to the right immediately." So I broke off, and we flew away like we didn't see anything. And we called every ground commander. We called clear back to Tonsanute to make sure there were no friendly troops in that area, and we were assured that there were no friendly troops in there. If there was anybody there, it was bad guys. And so we turned back around and flew back toward the target. One of the things when we were flying in the firing circle, you had to keep the engine RPM up high, and the exhaust flame was sticking out about 2 feet behind each engine. There was 3 exhausts on each corner of the engine, and there was fire coming out because you're running at high RPM. And so we didn't want them to see that, so we climbed up about 300, 400 feet so we could kind of coast into the firing circle. And the NOS, he focused on the campfires, and wherever he pointed that night observation device, it showed up on my crosshairs, And if I lined up the aircraft crosshairs with his, then he was pointing where I was going to shoot. And so we rolled in, and we had all 4 guns at high rate, which meant we were shooting 24,000 rounds a minute. And of course, you couldn't shoot that very long because we didn't have but about 50,000 rounds on us maximum. But we rolled in on the target, and I did several bursts, but we ended up expending probably 35,000 rounds in a couple of minutes. We circled the target one time, and the night observation navigator kept saying, I see sparks and I see ricochets and I see bigger fires. And with the naked eye, me looking through the eyepiece, I could see some explosions and things like that going on. So I know we hit something pretty good. And so we expended what we were going to expend, and then we pulled off the target because we figured we probably made them mad and they're going to shoot back at us. And so we flew on off, and like I say, we were about out of bullets, so we didn't stay on in country that much longer. We went on back home. We didn't know, whether we'd done good or whether it was possible we shot some good people. We don't know that. So the next day we show up for our flight again, and somebody says, hey, come in here and look at the board. And we went in there, and under Shadow Shooter of the Week, there was Shadow 26 was the Shooter of the Week, that we had 600 confirmed kills. The Cambodian friendly troops had gone into that area that morning and confirmed that we had gotten a big regiment of North Vietnamese, and they were all camped out. They were headed south to create damage for us. So I was pretty proud of the effect that we had and on our shooting that particular day. So that worked out well. And there's just things like that. You never know whether you're shooting the right people or the wrong people. I know if you shot the wrong people, you go up for court-martial, and that wasn't a good thing to happen. So we didn't like that. But we had another incident that I'm kind of, again, proud of, that I want to brag about a little bit, is one evening we were getting ready to take off, and I had a brand new co-pilot they had just sent in there, and he was going to fly his first mission with my crew. And so we went out and we did the engine run up, and everything looked good on the engine, and flight engineer, he said everything's good. So we pulled out on the runway, and we run the engines up and release the brakes, and off we roll. And this brings me to that instructor that I had at school that said, add 10 knots to your takeoff speed. Well, I had done that on every takeoff that I'd have done since he told me that. And I did the same thing that afternoon. It was a late afternoon takeoff. As soon as we lifted off, I called for gear up. The co-pilot would go over and flip the switch to make the gear come up while I had my hands on the throttles and the yoke. As soon as the gear started up, the right engine shut off completely. And, of course, you notice an immediate yaw turn toward the dead engine because you got all the power coming out the left side and no power on the right side. Not only that, we had the drag of the flaps were still down and the gear was still coming up, and the hydraulics only had half the system to make all this stuff work. The flight engineer, McCormick, super guy, saved our life that day. He and I both grabbed the bad throttle. We said, okay, we're going to pull the bad throttle back to see if it changes anything that what we're doing to confirm that is the bad engine. We did, and nothing changed. So we left it off, and I says, Mac, feather the prop. Well, all of a sudden, this brand new co-pilot, he starts trying to grab throttles and this, that, and the other. And Mac and I both slapped his hand and said, don't touch nothing, just sit there. And I was struggling to keep the aircraft straight because as soon as you turn it a little bit sideways with all the doors and windows that are no longer on the aircraft because you got guns sticking out of them and night observation devices and lights and all this kind of stuff, that would be like throwing a sail out to stop you. But I kept the aircraft straight, and we only made it, we were about 100 feet, I guess, by the time that the engine, shut down. The prop didn't want to feather because the hydraulics were real slow. So we had a lot of drag, but eventually the prop straightened out. The gear finally came up, and we weren't losing altitude. We were about 100, 150 feet in the air, and we got the flaps up, and I just went straight out because I wanted to get more airspeed. But if I hadn't had that extra 10 knots of airspeed, we'd have crashed right at the end of the runway because there would have been no way we could have kept. I sacrificed some of the extra 10 knots airspeed in order to get a little more altitude, and that saved us. So we're driving out, and I'm yelling at my gunners, throw out all the heavy stuff. So we threw all the bullets out. We threw out all of the flares. We had 16 flares, and they all weighed probably 30 pounds apiece. And we had about 40,000 rounds of ammunition. They threw all of those out. And anything else that wasn't tied down, in fact, one of the gunners, he called up, he said, "Pilot, you want me to throw the parachutes out?" And I said, "No, we're not going to use them because we're too low, but it's going to take too much paperwork if we have to fill out and explain why we threw parachutes out of a plane." So he said, "Okay." So we finally managed to, the flight engineer, McCormick, he was keeping the engine hot, but if you get it too hot, you lose power. And they have these cowlings that are on the outside of each engine, and you can open them and close them like you're allowing radiator air to go through. And if you keep them open too much to keep the engine cool, then it causes drag, so it slows you down. But if you have them too closed, then you don't have the drag, but the engine gets too hot and you lose performance that way. So McCormick was working those cowlings open and closed, and he said, "Pilot, I don't know how long we can keep this engine running at the temperature that we're at." So I slowly turned it to the right, and we headed back toward the base. We made it all the way back to final, and we were still only like 200 feet in the air. And the next important issue was lowering the gear, because once you start lowering the gear, you increase the drag, which is going to increase your rate of descent. And if you drop them too soon, you're not going to have enough to get to the runway. If you drop them too late, you're going to be ready to land on the ground and your gear's not down. Well, luckily, the timing worked out almost perfect. We put the gear down, and the two main gear locked in. We were probably not 20 feet in the air, but the nose gear didn't. And I had one of the gunners, he was looking through this little sight hole where he could see the nose gear, and he kept saying, "It looks like it's down, it looks like it's down," but on our gauges, it didn't show it was down. It didn't show green. And just as I touched the main gear down, and I was holding the nose up because I didn't know if it was down or not, the impact from hitting the ground pushed the nose gear, and it locked in gear, and we got 3 green. And so then we had all 3 gear down, and we landed on the roll, and we got back safe and sound. Now, this had happened to 2 other aircraft in the past, and in those 2 instances, everyone on board just about was killed every time. There's just no way that the plane could fly at the weight that we were at on one engine. Well, something above us was looking down on us and protecting us because we made it through and brought the plane back. That was probably the closest I've been to death ever. And like I say, you're right in the middle of it, and everything kind of in a way goes in slow motion, but at the same time it was moving pretty fast. Everything was happening quick. But I'm so thankful that we lived through that. I'm so thankful that the flight engineer, McCormick, was able to keep that engine running with all the power we could get out of it. The only other thing about that flight was I had the squadron commander, a guy named Tommy Teal. He was a colonel, and he's a nice old boy, but he never did check out as a pilot. He couldn't pass the check ride to be a pilot, and he'd been a pilot for 30 years probably, but he just couldn't pass his check ride. So in order for him to get his combat pay, he had to get at least 4 hours of combat time every month. So he'd jump on somebody's other plane and ride in the jump seat. And right after we lost the engine, Colonel Teal got on the intercom, and he says, "Hey, pilot," he says, "are we going to crash?" And I calmly as I could, I said, "Well, Colonel, I'm going to try my best not to crash. I'm doing all I can." And he never said another word, but he was all of us were kind of crying when we got back on the ground. It was, like I say, it was a miracle that we lived through that. But I was happy it happened that way, and I'm happy that I'm still alive.